What is the Denver Broncos draft philosophy heading into next Thursday's NFL draft in Las Vegas, Nevada? We heard a lot from General Manager George Paton and Darren Mougey about their thoughts on trading up, trading back. What are their options at pick number 64, plus their philosophy on taking players they already have various players on their depth chart as is in this year's NFL draft. You get that much more in today's special Lockdown Broncos short.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
One thing we learned from General Manager George Paton's pre-draft press conference, Sarah, what is the Broncos draft philosophy? Now, in my opinion, the takeaway that I brought out of this, obviously, was a 37-minute press conference alongside George Paton, Darren Mougey, the assistant general manager, and both guys answered a lot of questions. But there were a couple of branch points that I feel like are super important when you read through all the smoke and mirrors, you read through all the generic answers that you do get when asked certain questions. And I feel like I have a pretty solid understanding here on where this Broncos draft philosophy may be here, Sarah. Now, I think he was asked a really good question. What were George Paton's thoughts on drafting immediate contributors versus players who have high upside and maybe can play sometime down the road? I like George's quote here, and it gives me a little bit more insight as to what he said since day one as a GM. He said one of the things, we want to take the best player. Now, if he's not quite ready week one, that's fine. We want a guy to be here long term, and that speaks to what he talked about with we want to draft and we want to develop guys and we want to get them to second contracts. That is a hard mark to do in the NFL today. Not many teams have that emphasis, but George Paton, the Broncos, they've been all in on it. And I think that with the 2021 draft class that they have a lot of solid ground to build on here for this Broncos football team.
Well, I think that 2021 NFL draft class can really serve as the blueprint or the proof of what he's talking about. Because like we mentioned in a previous episode, that 2021 class, they didn't come in as instant, immediate contributors. Like Patrick Surtain II, he was not even a day one starter for the Broncos. And he only got a starting opportunity week 2 last season against the Jaguars because Ronald Darby got injured. So that pushed him into the starting lineup where he remained, obviously, the rest of the season. And of course, injuries can propel these guys into the starting lineup to become impact players year one. But I love that their philosophy is not to say, hey, it's a non-negotiable that this guy is ready to play week one. I don't think that should be a necessity when you're talking about the NFL draft. He made a great point. These are 4 or 5 year investments in players. And like you said, they want to get these guys to that second contract, which has always been George Paton's goal. He said that from his first press conference with the team. They want to draft, they want to develop, they want to get their guys to second contracts, which means there's an emphasis on player development. So I think that just really opens things up in terms of what direction do they go at pick number 64, or do they move up a little bit and get somebody? And if they move up for somebody, the pressure is not necessarily on that guy to come in and be an immediate starter. You have the freedom and the ability to kind of learn and grow as you kind of need to.
One thing that George Paton did say, though, that kind of stood out to me, he said, hey, we don't have that pressure of having a round one pick. He said, really, when you have a first round pick, you really focus on making sure that you can find the right guy that's going to come in and be the guy that you need, not necessarily reaching. He said, at pick number 64, we really just have the chance to maybe get the people that we want. We can just sit back, see how the board falls. If we need to move up, we can. And he did allude to the fact that, hey, it would take a lot of capital to move back up into round one, but he said, we're not opposed to moving up into round two. Obviously at 64, you maybe want to jump up maybe 15 spots. Okay. You can, alleviate a little bit of that back end capital, something that we've seen them do a little bit of. And if there's really a guy that they want in round two, of this year's NFL draft, we know that the Broncos will look to move up from 64, but they're content. George Paton is content. He said, we're not like the Rams. We like our picks. I like that little sub jab there he has, with Les Snead. Obviously, he's really close with Les there. But I think that is something that's interesting. Going back to he said, I wouldn't rule it out. Much more likely we move up in round 2, or we could see the Broncos move back. And I know Broncos country, if they move back from 64, I imagine there's going to be some freaking out because people are like, hey, now, we're not even in the top 70 now in picks. We want to be able to pick a guy at 64. You might get a really good player there. But it leads me to my next point here, Sarah, and I think it's super important. George Paton said it. We believe, when you look at guys that have high upside, there's a lot of people that I think you and I like and that media and fans like in general, that they're like, hey, this would be a great fit for the Broncos. But internally, the Broncos may not believe that player could be a really good scheme fit for them. Denver is very focused on, hey, we want to bring in the right fit with this scheme, with this coaching staff, and with our roster. I mean, how important of a differentiation is that between like guys that we would like that are flashy, that have like high athleticism, high traits, but maybe the Broncos don't view them as scheme guys?
Well, I think that's hugely important, and that speaks to the importance of everything that this front office, this coaching staff, they really prioritize highly, which is collaboration, right? I mean, these guys, they want to collaborate with each other, and they alluded to that in this press conference, how many guys they sent out on the road to collect information. They even talked about having on some prospects in this draft 9 different reports on individual prospects from different people within the organization, whether that's a scout, whether that's a coach, or whoever it may be, personality evaluators. So I just think there's such a thorough examination happening from all these different guys, and that's going to allow you to find guys that are scheme fits, and I think that one thing that always bothered me about the previous regime, Cody, is it felt like, okay, we have a round hole and we need to find square pegs to fit in these. We're willing to take square pegs to fit into the round holes. I think it's a much better idea to try to find guys that obviously fit through the round hole. They can go in and they can contribute. They can do things, play on special teams, fit into your scheme, pick up the terminology. I think that's why you saw last year the Broncos took a lot of guys from really big time schools with a lot of former professional coaches, former NFL coaches, and not professional. They're professionals at the college level as well in terms of the coaches, but former NFL guys. And you see Alabama, you see Texas, you see LSU, all these different programs down there that they're learning the certain terminology that's going to help them translate to the next level. That's not to say that small school guys can't, but I think that when you're talking about scheme fits, you have to find guys that fit. Well, what does Nathaniel Hackett want to do offensively? Well, we know he wants to run wide zone. So you're obviously not going to take a big lumbering offensive lineman early on in the draft. You're going to want to find guys that have great length, great athleticism, high relative athletic scores, things like that. So I think that those are the types of things that you have to be looking out for, because otherwise it becomes just hey, you're fighting a losing battle here. You're slamming your head against a concrete wall, so to speak, through the NFL draft.
Well, and one thing that was asked too is, George Paton, what is the deepest position this year's draft class? And he did mention edge rusher. And they said, well, what happens, if you take an edge rusher, what does that say about your players on the roster? George Paton said, it doesn't mean anything. It means that we have some really good players. He said one thing, he said, you go back to the Indianapolis Colts years with Paton, you go to the Broncos years with Paton, when you have all these pass rushers, when you get a lead, you can just send them and go. So the philosophy necessarily, if the Broncos take a pass rusher, it's not indicative of what they think of Bradley Chubb, Malik Reed, Jonathan Cooper, Randy Gregory. It's saying, hey, we believe this guy can fit into what we want. And it may not be in year 1 right away, but it could be year 2. It could be in year 3. And George Paton seemingly has that philosophy. So edge rusher, I mean, how much of a ploy is that there? But Sarah, you had an interesting observation from this press conference. All the positions that were mentioned here by George Paton makes you think like, okay, are they looking at tackle? Are they looking at edge rusher, cornerback? They said a lot of love. They even mentioned quarterback too, but there was one position that was left out that has us feeling at least like a little superstitious that this could actually be the position they're looking at in round 2.
I know, Cody. I'm not superstitious. I am a little stitious, like Michael Scott from The Office. I think that, I mean, obviously, you read the tea leaves in these things. You could drive yourself absolutely crazy reading tea leaves, but you're right. He mentioned almost every position, top to bottom, on both sides of the ball, except for one position that was conveniently left out in, like you said, the 37-minute press conference, and that was the tight end position. And he didn't mention it a single time. Nobody asked about Albert Okwuegbunam being the tight end 1. Nobody asked about any of the backups at the position. Nobody asked about draft prospects. George Paton or Darren Mougey, neither of them offered any information about this year's tight end group, which by all accounts fits what he described in terms of like the depth of the class overall, just being stronger in the later rounds because of the sheer number of prospects. But never once was the tight end position mentioned by name. I found that interesting because, like you said, they talked about quarterbacks. I mean, they name dropped Kenny Pickett and one other guy, I can't remember who it was, but they name dropped even some quarterbacks, and they talked about corner, and they talked about running backs. They talked about linebacker. They went into some specific detail about what they look for at the linebacker position from guys with tools, guys with instincts, guys that, and they talked about Josie Jewell, and they never once mentioned the tight end position. So if you're a conspiracy theorist, file that one away and let's see what happens a week from today. We may know a week from today, Cody, whether or not tight end was atop their priority list.
Well, how are you feeling, Broncos country, about the Denver Broncos' potential NFL draft strategy outlined by George Paton and Darren Mougey? Let us know in the comment section down below here on YouTube, or let us know on Twitter at CodyWorkNFL, at Lockdown Broncos, at Sarah Bettinger for all the action here. Lockdown Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Make sure you're subscribed, free and available everywhere you get your podcast.